in the last week and the steps we're taking to address the rapidly evolving events. My national security team and I have been closely monitoring the situation on the ground in Afghanistan and moving quickly to execute the plans we had put in place to respond to every constituency, including and contingency, including the rapid collapse we're seeing now. I'll speak more in a moment about the specific steps we're taking, but I want to remind everyone how we got here and what America's interests are in Afghanistan. We went to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago with clear goals. Get those who attacked us on September 11, 2001, and make sure al-Qaeda could not use Afghanistan as a base from which to attack us again. We did that. We severely degraded al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We never gave up the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and we got him. That was a decade ago. Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been: preventing a terrorist attack on America's homeland. I've argued for many years that our mission should be narrowly focused on counterterrorism, not counterinsurgency or nation building. That's why I opposed the surge when it was proposed in 2009 when I was vice president. And that's why, as president, I'm adamant that we focus on the threats we face today in 2021, not yesterday's threats. Today, the terrorist threat has metastasized well beyond Afghanistan. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Nusra in Syria, ISIS attempting to create a caliphate in Syria and Iraq, and establishing affiliates in multiple countries in Africa and Asia. These threats warrant our attention and our resources. We conduct effective counterterrorism missions against terrorist groups in multiple countries where we don't have permanent military presence. If necessary, we'll do the same in Afghanistan. We've developed counterterrorism over-the-horizon capability that will allow us to keep our eyes firmly fixed on the direct threats to the United States and the region, and act quickly and decisively if needed. When I came into office, I inherited a deal that President Trump negotiated with the Taliban. Under his agreement, U.S. forces would be out of Afghanistan by May 1, 2021, just a little over 3 months after I took office. U.S. forces had already drawn down during the Trump administration from roughly 15,500 American forces to 2,500 troops in country. And the Taliban was at its strongest militarily since 2001. The choice I had to make as your president was either to follow through on that agreement or be prepared to go back to fighting the Taliban in the middle of the spring fighting season. There would have been no ceasefire after May 1. There was no agreement protecting our forces after May 1. There was no status quo of stability without American casualties after May 1. There was only a cold reality of either following through on the agreement to withdraw our forces or escalating the conflict and sending thousands more American troops back into combat in Afghanistan, lurching into the third decade of conflict. I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I would be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves. We spent over $1 trillion. We trained and equipped an Afghan military force with some 300,000 strong, incredibly well equipped, a force larger in size than the militaries of many of our NATO allies. We gave them every tool they could need. We paid their salaries, provided for the maintenance of their Air Force, something that Taliban doesn't have. Taliban does not have an Air Force. We provided close air support. We gave them every chance to determine their own future. What we could not provide them was the will to fight for that future. There's some very brave and capable Afghan special forces units and soldiers. But if Afghanistan is unable to mount any real resistance to the Taliban now, there is no chance that 1 year, 1 more year, 5 more years, or 20 more years of U.S. military boots on the ground would have made any difference. Here's what I believe to my core. It is wrong to order American troops to step up when Afghanistan's own armed forces would not. The political leaders of Afghanistan were unable to come together for the good of their people, unable to negotiate for the future of their country when the chips were down. They would never have done so while U.S. troops remained in Afghanistan, bearing the brunt of the fighting for them. And our true strategic competitors, China and Russia, would love nothing more than the United States to continue to funnel billions of dollars in resources and attention into stabilizing Afghanistan indefinitely. When I hosted President Ghani and Chairman Abdullah at the White House in June, and again when I spoke by phone to Ghani in July, we had very frank conversations. We talked about how Afghanistan should prepare to fight their civil wars after the U.S. military departed, to clean up the corruption in government so the government could function for the Afghan people. We talked extensively about the need for Afghan leaders to unite politically. They fail to do any of that. I also urge them to engage in diplomacy, to seek a political settlement with the Taliban. This advice was flatly refused. Mr. Ghani insisted that the Afghan forces would fight, but obviously he was wrong. So I'm left again to ask of those who argue that we should stay, how many more generations of America's daughters and sons would you have me send to fight Afghanistan's civil war when Afghan troops will not? How many more lives, American lives, is it worth? How many endless rows of headstones at Arlington National Cemetery? I'm clear on my answer. I will not repeat the mistakes we've made in the past. Mistake of staying and fighting indefinitely in a conflict that is not in the national interest of the United States, of doubling down on a civil war in a foreign country, of attempting to remake a country through the endless military deployments of U.S. forces. Those are the mistakes we cannot continue to repeat because we have significant vital interest in the world that we cannot afford to ignore. I also want to acknowledge how painful this is to so many of us. The scenes we're seeing in Afghanistan, they're gut-wrenching, particularly for our veterans, our diplomats, humanitarian workers, for anyone who has spent time on the ground working to support the Afghan people, for those who have lost loved ones in Afghanistan, and for Americans who have fought and served in the country, serve our country in Afghanistan. This is deeply, deeply personal. It is for me as well. I've worked on these issues as long as anyone. I've been throughout Afghanistan during this war, while the war was going on, from Kabul to Kandahar to the Kunar Valley. I've traveled there on 4 different occasions. I met with the people. I've spoken to the leaders. I spent time with our troops. And I came to understand firsthand what was and was not possible in Afghanistan. So now we're focused on what is possible. We will continue to support the Afghan people. We will lead with our diplomacy, our international influence, and our humanitarian aid. We'll continue to push for regional diplomacy and engagement to prevent violence and instability. We'll continue to speak out for the basic rights of the Afghan people, of women and girls, just as we speak out all over the world. I've been clear, the human rights must be the center of our foreign policy, not the periphery. But the way to do it is not through endless military deployments. It's with our diplomacy, our economic tools, and rallying the world to join us. Well, let me lay out the current mission in Afghanistan. I was asked to authorize, and I did, 6,000 U.S. troops to deploy to Afghanistan for the purpose of assisting in the departure of U.S. and allied civilian personnel from Afghanistan, and to evacuate our Afghan allies and vulnerable Afghans to safety outside of Afghanistan. Our troops are working to secure the airfield and to ensure continued operation of both the civilian and military flights. We're taking over air traffic control. We have safely shut down our embassy and transferred our diplomats. Our diplomatic presence is now consolidated at the airport as well. Over the coming days, we intend to transport out thousands of American citizens who've been living and working in Afghanistan. We'll also continue to support the safe departure of civilian personnel, the civilian personnel of our allies who are still serving in Afghanistan. Operation Allies Refugee, which I announced back in July, has already moved 2,000 Afghans who are eligible for special immigration visas and their families to the United States. In the coming days, the U.S. military will provide assistance to move more SIV-eligible Afghans and their families out of Afghanistan. We're also expanding refugee access to cover other vulnerable Afghans who worked for our embassy. U.S. non-governmental agencies or U.S. non-governmental organizations and Afghans who otherwise are at great risk, and U.S. news agencies. I know there are concerns about why we did not begin evacuating Afghans civilians sooner. Part of the answer is some of the Afghans did not want to leave earlier, still hopeful for their country. And part of it because the Afghan government and its supporters discouraged us from organizing a mass exodus to avoid triggering, as they said, a crisis of confidence. American troops are performing this mission as professionally and as effectively as they always do, but it is not without risks. As we carry out this departure, we have made it clear to the Taliban, if they attack our personnel or disrupt our operation, the U.S. presence will be swift and the response will be swift and forceful. We will defend our people with devastating force if necessary. Our current military mission will be short in time, limited in scope, and focused in its objectives. Get our people and our allies to safety as quickly as possible. And once we have completed this mission, we will conclude our military withdrawal. We will end America's longest war after 20 long years of bloodshed. The events we're seeing now are sadly proof that no amount of military force would ever deliver a stable, united, secure Afghanistan. as known in history as the graveyard of empires. What's happening now could just as easily happen 5 years ago or 15 years in the future. You have to be honest. Our mission in Afghanistan is taking many missteps, made many missteps over the past 2 decades. I'm now the 4th American president to preside over war in Afghanistan, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. I will not pass this responsibility on to a 5th president. I will not mislead the American people by claiming that just a little more time in Afghanistan will make all the difference. Nor will I shrink from my share of responsibility for where we are today and how we must move forward from here. I am President of the United States of America, and the buck stops with me. I'm deeply saddened by the facts we now face. But I do not regret my decision to end America's warfighting in Afghanistan and maintain a laser focus on our counterterrorism missions there and other parts of the world. Our mission to degrade the terrorist threat of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and kill Osama bin Laden was a success. Our decades-long effort to overcome centuries of history and permanently change and remake Afghanistan was not, and I wrote and believed it never could be. I cannot and will not ask our troops to fight on endlessly in another country's civil war, taking casualties, suffering life-shattering injuries, leaving families broken by grief and loss. This is not in our national security interest. It is not what the American people want. It is not what our troops, who have sacrificed so much over the past 2 decades, deserve. I made a commitment to the American people when I ran for president that I would bring America's military involvement in Afghanistan to an end. While it's been hard and messy, and yes, far from perfect, I've honored that commitment. More importantly, I made a commitment to the brave men and women who serve this nation that I wasn't going to ask them to continue to risk their lives in a military action that should have ended long ago. Our leaders did that in Vietnam when I got here as a young man. I will not do it in Afghanistan. I know my decision will be criticized, but I would rather take all that criticism than pass this decision on to another president of the United States, another one, a 5th, because it's the right one, it's the right decision for our people, the right one for our brave service members who risk their lives serving our nation, and it's the right one for America. Thank you. May God protect our troops, our diplomats, and all brave Americans serving in harm's way.
The President of the United States owning and defending his decision to withdraw all American troops out of Afghanistan, defending the decision to send some back in order to help with the evacuations there. He said, I stand squarely behind my decision, and raising the question saying how many more soldiers and troops should he send into this war when Afghan forces, in his words, will not defend themselves. He said, I will not ask our troops to fight on endlessly. Afghanistan and being there, in his words, quote, this is not in our national security interests. However, there is chaos still on the ground in Afghanistan as the Taliban have taken over. CBS's Roxana Saberi is in Kabul reporting from an undisclosed location for security reasons. And Roxana, tell us what has been happening on the ground today.
Well, Nora, the Taliban now say they're back in charge, and their entry into the city was so swift that it set many Afghans into a panic. There's still that feeling of desperation that is undeniable, and you saw that in those scenes at the Kabul airport today, where some Afghans were so afraid of the return to Taliban rule that they clung to the side of that U.S. military aircraft as it was taking off, and at least 2 were seen falling to their death. As you mentioned earlier, Nora, the civilian side of the airport has been shut down for now. But just over the past half hour, as the president started speaking, we heard a few military aircraft land. That is a sign, surely, that the evacuation of U.S. civilians, citizens, and their Afghan allies is continuing. Now, all this is happening as the Taliban fighters have been seen walking in the streets of Kabul armed, also in vehicles left behind by the retreating Afghan forces. The Taliban have vowed that they're going to keep order under Sharia law. They also vow that they will not harm civilians or foreigners or diplomats, and that they will respect women's rights. But the Afghans we have spoken to don't trust these promises. At least 2 are now in hiding because they fear what might happen to them. At the same time, we've and others, if they blame Americans for leaving them, they say they feel abandoned, but they're even more disappointed in their own government. And right now, they're resigned, afraid, and uncertain about the future. Nora?
Roxana Saberi in an undisclosed location in Kabul for us. And as Roxana mentioned, President Biden laying the blame on Afghan forces, on the Afghan President Ghani, who in June saying that they failed to do any of the work to unite politically, and blamed him essentially for abandoning the country and leaving the country when the Taliban took over. Let's bring national security correspondent David Martin. He is at the Pentagon. And David, the president approving that request for 6,000 troops to help secure the embassy and the airport there and get many of our people out of Afghanistan. But what's the thinking with inside the Pentagon about what a mess this is?
Well, everybody was surprised, including the Taliban, at the speed of this collapse. But there's the humiliation of the moment, but the real problem is getting that airport working and getting people out, because you're talking about first the Americans. He said thousands of Americans, counting the embassy diplomats. So there's thousands of Americans out there in Afghanistan. And then there are tens of thousands of Afghans who worked for the U.S., the State Department, the CIA, the military during the war, who now have good reason to fear for their lives. Are we going to be able to get them out? There is no provision that I know of for getting them to the airport. They have to get to the airport on their own. And of course, we know that getting to the airport is not necessarily the answer to your problem, because of the chaos that reigns there. So when Roxana said she heard military transports landing during that speech, that was good news, because that means that's more troops coming in, more troops to establish order at that airfield. And then with every plane that goes in, that's one more plane to fill up with about 250 passengers to take out. But we still don't understand what's going to happen to all those Afghans who have to make it to the airport on their own. And frankly, I think the honor of the United States depends on getting those Afghans out.
And David, answer that question, because while people may agree with President Biden that it's time to end the war in Afghanistan, the way it ended and the way that the Taliban was able to so swiftly take control, the way that we have thousands of not only U.S. citizens there, but also those who have helped our forces on the ground, as you mentioned, that they are left in harm's way, that aftermath was handled poorly. Is that where some of the blame will be placed within the Biden administration for failing to anticipate that?
I think everybody recognizes that we pumped way too much money into Afghanistan, to the point where it fueled corruption, so that corruption became as big an enemy as the Taliban. And then when the U.S. started to withdraw, all the things that the U.S. military is good at, airstrikes, medevac, resupply of food and ammunition, went away. And those Afghan soldiers were left out there in the provinces, knowing no one was going to come to rescue them. They'd be lucky if they got fed. And so this military that we had tried to inculcate with the motto of no man left behind suddenly turned into a military of every man for himself.
Well put, David Martin. Thank you. As the President of the United States also mentioning that Afghanistan has been known as the graveyard of empires. Let's bring in our senior White House and political correspondent, Ed O'Keefe, who is at the White House. And Ed, I was struck by the president defending his decision so vociferously here, trying to explain that this is not in America's national security, that our mission should be about counterterrorism, not counterinsurgency or nation building, and then in his words, no amount of military force could have turned Afghanistan into a democracy.
Yeah, and he's been remarkably consistent on that, Nora, since he was a candidate and since he took office earlier this year, reiterating that while he wanted to get U.S. forces out of Afghanistan, they weren't going to be able to meet the May 1 deadline that had been set by the Trump administration, instead extending it to the end of this month in order to have troops out by the end of, or by the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. Remarkable in his frankness, as he has been over the course of the pandemic, for example, explaining awful truths to the country and to the world, and doing it again yet today, saying that this is a hard and messy withdrawal, and admitting this did unfold more quickly than we anticipated. But in many ways, Nora, it sounded like the I told you so speech, something that he's been reiterating in conversations with military and national security leaders for the last 15 years in these kinds of meetings, saying this kind of conflict was unnecessary. One other note, Nora, the president is headed back to Camp David for the evening. He was scheduled to be there for part of this week during what was supposed to be a 2-week working vacation outside the White House. White House saying he's headed back there in a little bit.
Ed O'Keefe, thank you for that update. I also want to bring in CBS News senior foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata from London, because Charlie has been to Afghanistan dozens of times, has spent considerable time with Afghan soldiers. And so, Charlie, I want to ask you about that. You heard the president say that American troops shouldn't be fighting and dying in a war that Afghans aren't willing to fight themselves. You've been with them. Did they lack the will? What happened?
Well, Nora, there's an element of truth to that, of course. They didn't fight any battle on any front. That became patently clear. And when I spoke to General Scott Miller the last time that we were both together in Afghanistan, he was the commander of U.S. and NATO forces, he said his biggest fear was if we saw these provincial capitals collapse one after another. But what David Martin has pointed out is extremely crucial in what has unfolded. Now, when I've been with Afghan and U.S. forces, the Afghan troops will be out. Remember, U.S. combat troops really haven't been engaged in ground combat for some time. As soon as they get into trouble, they call in U.S. airstrikes. Close air support is really important. Having those helicopters there. Medevac is really important. As soon as you take that away from the equation, they lose confidence. And the Taliban had the momentum, the Afghan forces were losing morale, and what's really important here is when they start picking off cities like Kandahar and Herat and Kunduz to the north, the Afghan forces aren't capable of fighting several fronts. They can't defend any of these places because it's difficult to get around Afghanistan. And who can solve that equation? Who can solve that problem? U.S. and coalition forces. The Afghan Air Force just isn't capable of moving men, weapons, or supplies to several battlefields, or any battlefields for that matter. And really, the only serious fighting force are the commandos, and there just aren't enough of them to go around.
Those are excellent points, Charlie D'Agata. Thank you, and for all of your reporting from Afghanistan over the years, including just this past year. And there we have it, the President of the United States defending the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, and the chaos, admitting it happened much quicker than they thought, but pledging to try and get Americans who are there and those who have helped Americans out of the country as soon as possible. The airport in Kabul has been shut down. Roxana reporting that she has heard at least that there might be some military planes landing, and that would be a good sign there at this hour. Our coverage will continue on our 24-hour streaming service, CBSN. You can watch it at cbsnews.com or download our CBS News app on your cell phone or connected TV. There'll be more on your local news, and we're going to have a full wrap-up tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Nora O'Donnell in Washington.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com.